The history of heavy.
Hello and welcome to episode 6 of the History of Heavy podcast. This is the show that traces the chronology of heavy music across genres song by song. I am your co-host, Michael Huntsman, alongside my fellow co-host, Big Daddy Dave Lieberman. Hello, David.
At your service.
How are you, man?
Doing good. I really enjoyed last week's conversation, and I'm looking forward to getting into another one. This is a little different than our previous episodes, and I'm eager to chat with you about it.
It really is. I think we expected Satisfaction to be a shorter conversation. I don't know why. I thought that was going to be a shorter episode. It turned out to be a longer episode. I think this one could teeter one way or the other. This one could go very long, or it could be very short. I am very excited to have this conversation. This is the first non-rock and roll song that we have talked about so far on the show. There are a number of songs that do not feature guitars that we will get into over the course of this podcast, beginning with John Coltrane. He is so far, I believe, the only jazz musician included on our list. That could change. We're updating that list all the time. No, Alice Coltrane is also included. So
don't we have Miles Davis on here as well?
Oh, of course. There's a fusion era Miles song. What am I talking about?
There's that one guy.
What am I talking about? All right. Well, Coltrane will be the first then of several jazz musicians we will get into, and I felt like he had to be included, and we will talk about why in just a moment, but not before we get into what was happening in 1966, Dave. Just a year removed from last week's conversation about the Stones, so I'm not sure how much you'll have to tell us, but what was going on that year?
Dave's Control.
Yeah, good tee up, because I have a very brief cultural context tonight. It's really so much of the same. What was dominating world events was the Vietnam War and several other spin-off coups and plane crashes and all kinds of political upheaval was happening at this time. That are kind of footnotes. I didn't know about any of these things until I started reading the wiki on this year. So it's a pretty abbreviated one. So I'll get right into it. April 21st, the first artificial heart is installed in the chest of Marcel de Ruyter in the Houston, Texas hospital. Also, April 21st, Haile Selassie visits Jamaica for the first time, meeting with Rasta leaders. And this is a significant date as April 21st, which is, I believe, Earth Day, but it's one day removed from Faux 20. And it's ironic that couldn't have just been a few hours before. April 24th, uniform daylight savings time is first observed in most parts of North America, much to the disdain of modern people. June 13th, Miranda v. Arizona. The Supreme Court of the United States rules that police must inform suspects of their rights before an arrest. And June 30th, the National Organization for Women, NOW, or NOW, is founded in Washington, D.C. In music, I did find a note that in 1966 in jazz, Ascension by John Coltrane is considered one of the most important jazz recordings of the 60s. And that is no small statement. The 60s was explosively prolific for jazz, and a lot of important jazz came out of the 60s. A couple of different movements were kind of solidified then that have just stayed with us for since then. So that is no small statement. But again, as with last week's episode, record of the year is Frank Sinatra, Strangers in the Night. Album of the year is Frank Sinatra, A Man and His Music. Song of the year, now we're starting to see that shift, Michelle by Lennon and McCartney, the Beatles. I thought this was fun. The best instrumental, the Batman theme by Neil Hefti. So that's the abbreviated cultural corner for 1966.
Yeah, just a kind of a continuation, and things in the world or in popular culture had not changed significantly in that year, which is probably a good thing, you know, not too much disruption. But a lot of disruption in the jazz world. And let me tell you a little bit about what was going on with Mr. Coltrane at the time. The legendary jazz saxophonist recorded the album Ascension on June 28th of 1965. The album marks a pivotal moment in Coltrane's discography and kind of a watershed in his career, as it was the first of his free jazz inspired works. Everything that came before Ascension is kind of a more traditional bebop jazz, and everything that came after it is significantly more avant-garde. At the time of the album's recording, he was one of the world's most commercially successful jazz musicians. A Love Supreme had just been nominated for a Grammy, and both Downbeat and Jazz magazines had voted it the album of the year. But around this time, Coltrane had befriended fellow saxophonist Albert Ayer and was becoming increasingly influenced by his experimental, rules-free approach to the instrument. The recording of Ascension took place at Van Gelder Studio in Inglewood Cliffs, New Jersey, with 5 saxophonists, including Coltrane, 2 trumpeters, 2 bass players, a piano player, and a drummer. Notably among them, Freddie Hubbard, Dewey Johnson, Pharoah Sanders, Archie Shepp, and McCoy Tyner. At the start of the session, Coltrane handed out lead sheets that included ensemble passages that were based on chords, but they were declared optional, as the soloists were encouraged to emphasize a spontaneous dialogue with the rhythm section, with no specific chords identified in each part. The tracking was completely improvised and recorded in 2 takes, each of which makes up 2 tracks on the album, which are listed as Edition 1, Parts 1 and 2, and Edition 2, Parts 1 and 2. Tonight, we're going to be talking about Edition 1, Part 1, but that is really for the sake of having a single song to put on our Spotify playlist. Any of the 4 tracks would suffice for the purposes of this conversation. At the end of the sessions for Ascension, saxophonist Marion Brown said that it was the kind of music that you could use to heat up an apartment on cold winter days. Reaction from the jazz world upon the album's release was equally intense, and though not universally positive, the prevailing opinion was neatly summed up by saxophonist Dave Lehman, not my co-host Dave Lieberman, but Dave Lehman, who said that the album blew everyone out of the water and that it was the torch that lit the free jazz movement. Which may be true, but Dave, why are we talking about it on the History of Heavy podcast?
I think that's why. There is no question of John Coltrane's greatness in individual contribution, but also in collaborative works in the pantheon of jazz and in greater music. An absolute master of his craft, and really established a lot in the genre of jazz. One of my favorites, which is kind of obvious, I think. If you're into jazz, it's hard to imagine appreciating jazz and not gravitating, liking John Coltrane. It's hard to imagine that. that's why we're talking about this. And this particular album, this recording, was heavy in that it was another rejection of the status quo. And this is a theme that will keep coming up, because this is what makes some things heavy, is their rejection of what is acceptable, of the mainstream, their embracing of that rejection. This is really avant-garde. And truth be told, I don't connect with this kind of music, and I don't connect with this part of John Coltrane. But I'm so in awe of the ability to know your craft so well that you can think in these terms. And I can connect with moments in the piece that we listened to, which tells me that there's this grounding of talent and an understanding that the understanding is so deep that it becomes this three-dimensional containment, and John Coltrane can move it around and put it upside down and do whatever he wants with it. He's not in it, he's outside of it, controlling it. And a piece like this comes across like that. I remember seeing a Anthony Bourdain, chef Anthony Bourdain show, and he was talking about how these New York chefs would get together at 1 a.m. somewhere, and they had this sheep's head, and it was like everybody was going crazy over how awesome it was. And I'm like, you get to a point where you've had all the truffle fries in the world that you can have, and it's not impressive anymore. And you've had the steak that's done perfect, and you've had some puree or some foam or some reduction or whatever, and you've done it, you've seen it and done it to death. There's a moment where the sheep's head excites you. And I'm not at that moment, but I can appreciate how somebody else can be. And so this piece is the sheep's head of jazz for me, right? This is so avant-garde, it's beyond my ability to appreciate, but I am so in awe of the ability to conceive of it that I wouldn't have thought to think of it. He got there with this ensemble of other giants in the craft. I just have to bow down to it. And it's the weight, the heaviness that is making me bend the knee.
Yeah. Last week, I talked about my Mount Rushmore of rock bands that you have to like to have an incredible opinion about rock music, in my opinion. The Beatles, the Ramones, AC/DC, and Black Sabbath. John Coltrane is certainly on that Mount Rushmore of jazz musicians that you have to at least appreciate and respect to have a credible opinion about jazz. What John Coltrane is that none of those four rock bands is, well, he's a lot of things that those four rock bands aren't. But one of the things that he is, or his discography is that theirs isn't, let's say, is varied and diverse and all over the place, right? Like Miles, his catalog varies extremes of like the most beautiful music you've ever heard and rambunctious noise, with every flavor and color in between. I want to talk about that rambunctious noise in a second, but given what you just said, I think I know the answer to this, but I'm curious, what's your sweet spot for Coltrane? Do you have a favorite record or a favorite era of Coltrane?
Giant Steps was my first introduction, and so that I just have a lot of affection for, because, and I've expressed this before, and it will come back to it again. The relationship I have with music is becomes connected to the recording of that music, and so sometimes it's difficult for me to connect with live performance. One of the things I like about jazz is because it's so unrestricted, I can do that. I can have an appreciation of live jazz and recorded jazz. And what's cool about that is that you'll be listening to live jazz and you'll hear it go through a theme that you recognize from a recording. I really love that about live jazz. But when it relates to, as it relates to the question you asked, Giant Steps is a friend, right? This is an album I spent a lot of time with, and I love Supreme as well. But and those are probably the two albums that I know the most and have listened to the most, and so that will suffice for my answer. But there's so much of his work and so many albums that he played on that weren't John Coltrane albums, but that he was a part of, that are important to me. So I'm going to go with Giant Steps with a Love Supreme sidecar.
Yeah, I think, A Love Supreme is kind of the Sergeant Pepper's almost, in terms of its, it's that, and then there's all the other ones kind of. But
Right.
Blue Train for me is kind of the one, which is 1958, so just prior to Giant Steps. My introduction to that album, and really well, I had Kind of Blue, the Miles Davis record, was the first jazz record I ever owned, and was the only jazz record I ever owned for a long time in the mid 80s. And in 1989, the song Blue Train, I didn't know it was the song Blue Train at the time, but is featured heavily in Spike Lee's Do the Right Thing. And that it gives me chills to think about it. Who is that? And it's like, oh, of course, that's John Coltrane. It's time, Huntsman, roll up your sleeves and dig into John Coltrane. And that's what did it, was that song being in Do the Right Thing. So yeah, and that music again is absolutely gorgeous and melodic and emotional. When we get to Ascension, this is a different thing, and in all honesty, this is not a Coltrane I am nearly as familiar with. I do love fusion, I do love avant-garde jazz, and we'll get into some, as we mentioned earlier, in later episodes of the show. Coltrane not as familiar, but I think Ascension, in addition to everything you said about Coltrane as an artist, the rules being broken of the form to make this music, all the things that make it heavy that have nothing to do with the sonics are true. The sonics here, though, to me, are extremely heavy and really important as we look at the evolution of other genres of avant-garde heavy music. I will continue to reference your Sun sweatshirt, your Sun hoodie. The music Sun makes, the music the band Earth makes, a lot of drone metal, certainly a lot of ambient music. All of those kind of experience, from Glenn Branca to Suicide to Brian Eno, are all informed by John Coltrane. And listening to this record, and this record is a really good illustration of why I love music so much. I listen to music all day long. It's playing in the background in my office if I'm not on a call. I have headphones in when I'm walking the dogs, listening. I listen to music practically almost all day. And listening to Ascension for this conversation in recent weeks, it really struck me how time and place is vital for me to listen to this music. I cannot listen to Ascension as background music like I often do with Brian Eno. I listen to music for airports.
Brian Eno is background music.
Yeah, so it's the greatest background music.
Yeah.
Even like, to make a Brian Eno connection, David Bowie, whose music is very singable and melodic, and I can listen to that in the background. I can listen to heavy, aggressive music in the background often. Ascension, I cannot. Ascension is music that demands your attention in kind of the best of ways, where when I was trying to listen to it while I was doing email or whatever, it was like driving me crazy. Like I can't, like to the point of like, do I like this shit? And I don't, if it's kind of in the atmosphere. But when I'm actively listening to it, fuck, it's incredible. It's incredible.
And that's it. Like, you really have to concentrate on what's happening in order to see the tapestry. Like, if it's happening in the background, it's just a blur. But if you're listening to it, you can see the threads, and you understand, okay, these threads are happening at the same time. And every once in a while you'll get some harmony, and then it'll go back into the chaos of creativity. But what you're hearing is this raw creativity. And it's so interesting to have that visceral connection to this ethereal, to the muse, right? Like, you're hearing the muse. This is their inspiration raw. And I have never heard any other music that quite does that. This piece in particular allowed me to experience the music in that way. And just as you said, like, it was disruptive to the point where I had to stop what I was doing and just sit quietly and close my eyes. And then there was something to do there. But it demands your active attention, because it's busy, it's too heavy to balance in the background. It's heavy. It absolutely deserves to be in our conversation.
Yeah, look, I want to be the first person to ever compare John Coltrane to Napalm Death. So I'm going to do that now. In 1987, they released their classic debut album, Scum. We will be talking about "You Suffer," their 1-second song, later on this podcast. But I remember when Scum came out, and this is at the height of Slayer and DRI and every band trying to be the fastest band in the world. And they marketed the Napalm Death record with stickers on it that said the fastest band in the world. And I remember my roommate Glenn at the time, who I did my other podcast with, on Manu Polanco podcast, shout out. Well, I remember when we were living together at the time, he brought it home and put it on, and we were just laughing. We're like, this sounds just like you can't even discern one instrument. It's just white noise. It's just oblivion, like, happening sonically. I'm not going to suggest that Napalm Death was inspired by John Coltrane, but there is a and we will try to chronicle this through our episodes.
I'll get you there.
There is a connectivity to that sensation of complete chaos happening in your ears that you have to actively make sense of to get any kind of enjoyment out of it at all. And the emotional response to it is instinctual almost. It's not anything I can even process. It's visceral.
No.
It's visceral.
Yeah, it's an impulse, right? And what I wanted to add, and what you sparked in me, was the dots that connect these two sonically, is that Napalm Death gets to exist because Ascension gives it permission. The fact that Ascension is there gives them permission. It gives Sonic Youth permission to tune their instruments that way. It gives Sun, all these bands get to play in the wake of Ascension.
Yeah. Yes. So we're going to be talking about Sun a lot on this podcast, I could tell. So I'll use Sun as an example. So I saw Sun open for Celtic Frost at the Fillmore in San Francisco in 2007, 2008 or something. I had no idea who they were. And I was like, what is this garbage? Like they're not playing anything. Like it's just one note of feedback for half an hour. Like what the fuck is this? This sucks. Years later, I mean, in recent years, they are one of my favorite and most listened to bands. And I've seen them 3 times. And seeing Sun live is visceral is exactly the right word for it. The music is completely physical and completely consuming, but you have to be focused on it happening. You can't be at the bar ordering a drink or trying to talk to you. Like it is all, I'm just repeating a lot of what we've said, but to make that connection to the avant-garde free jazz that John Coltrane was making in 1966, to the drone metal that Sun would make, decades later, and that it isn't just noise, that it isn't just accidental, that there is skill and a deliberate attention to detail in what they are doing, and that is. I often call Sun live. They're like watching an art installation. It's that as much as it is music. And Coltrane, now 6 episodes into this podcast, I think is probably fair to say, well, without question, he is the most definitively an artist versus everybody we've talked about since. And I think his art and Ascension, specifically for the sake of this conversation, demands to be looked at as art and not just he's not chasing those DJs that we talked about last week when we were talking about Satisfaction.
Yeah, Ascension is what a Jackson Pollock piece sounds like.
Right.
It's like, what is this mess? And then you look and you're like, there's color, there's absence of color,
Yes.
There's layer of color, there's intersections, there's blobs, there's a balance and an imbalance that's balanced. It is the art of art, and this is the sound of sonic. It's again, I said it already, but it's the muse. It's you're hearing the urge to make music, and this is what that sounds like. And when you learn to channel that urge, it sounds different. It sounds like songs, right? But the step before that is this. And it's not something I can really put on and listen to. And it's not something I have time to focus and concentrate on. But my God, it's so important. And it's great that it's there because it gives permission to all this other stuff. It allows us to get a 4th, 5th, 10th dimensionality to this dodecahedron of music that we're juggling. It does something new that hadn't been done, and it does it in a way that has gravity. It pulls you in because of its weight.
Yeah, and last week we talked about a through line of this heavy music being outsider music, and I think that is Ascension is a really good illustration of this. That it is not music for passive listening. It is not music for pop charts. A lot of the songs we have talked about, and will talk about were massive hit singles. We're big popular songs, but there is still an otherness to them that again demands your attention, and you have to be vested in the thing. It's not throwaway. It's maybe calling it important is too much. Well, it's not for Ascension, but maybe it's too much for some of the things we'll be talking about. But it's important, and it feels important, and I think that's why it's so beloved, and that's why we're doing a 150 episode podcast about it, because this stuff matters to us.
in the best way.
In the best way. In the best way. Dave, anything else on Ascension or John Coltrane?
Just this was a new experience for me, and it just helps me appreciate the brilliance of John Coltrane and the boldness and the risk taking and the hubris to be able to not give a fuck and do what you're driven to do, what you're compelled to do, what you're called to do. He owned this. This was a product of his being, and we get to listen to what it's like to be John Coltrane.
Really well said. He was a true genius, and to go back to the quote at the top, from Marion Brown, is that this is music that you could heat your apartment to. If that's not fucking heavy, I don't know what is.
Yeah.
Look, every week we pit our current champion song against this week's current song. It almost seems unseemly and unfair to pit anything against Ascension, but that is the task that we have been given. We have a shared champion right now, that is the Witch by the Sonics. I personally am going to go out on the limb and I'm going to keep the Sonics, just because, as great as I'm not even going to dare to begin to argue that the Witch is a better song than Ascension. It's not, but for my personal taste and for the sake of this exercise, I am going to take the Witch into our conversation next week. What about you?
I am going to take the Witch because I like that song and I will listen to it over and over again, without disrespecting Ascension. Like this is a hard line to walk because it depends on what you're asking. What's heavier? Ascension. What am I going to listen to tomorrow? The Witch.
Yeah.
And I'm always going to have appreciated this ability to get academic with John Coltrane and with this piece of music and with this album, because it helps me appreciate the rest so much more. But that's its weight, that's its heaviness, and it has a different listenability to it. So I can respect the shit out of it and choose the Witch.
Yeah. Well said. I think we're on the same page there. Next week, I think we're going to try to meet somewhere in the middle. We're going to stay in 1966, and somewhere in between the Sonics and John Coltrane lies Rocky Erickson and the 13th Floor Elevators. We are going to talk about You're Going to Miss Me, which I think is going to be a really fun conversation. We're going to get a little psychedelic and talk about the other spectrum of what was going on in 1966 besides John Coltrane. In the meantime, please subscribe to our channel on YouTube. Check out our Spotify playlist where you can kind of track what episodes we're going to be talking about and make suggestions if you would like. You can make those suggestions on Instagram or Blue Sky, where you will also find us. In the meantime, Dave, that was always fun as always. Keep it heavy, my brother.
Yeah, real good discussion. Okay, thank you. Bye.